Jen Carson had never imagined that the warm, familiar world of her childhood could collapse so suddenly. She was 8 years old, small enough to still collect shiny rocks in her pockets, old enough to notice when adults pretended things were fine. For a long time, her world had only two constants: her mother's soft voice, and the gentle laugh of the man she once proudly called Daddy. But in 1979, the laughter faded. Her parents' marriage, once a quiet shelter, cracked open like thin ice under too much weight. Arguments whispered behind closed doors. Tension grew heavy in the air, thick enough that even a child could feel it squeezing the house from the inside. And when the marriage finally collapsed, Jen did what children do best: she tried to hold on to the pieces. Her father, James Carson, drifted away from the life he once knew. He left behind the familiar sidewalks, the daily routines, the daughter who loved him fiercely. It wasn't long before he met another woman, someone who would pull him, and later Jen, into a darkness so unnatural that even nightmares seemed gentle compared to it. Her name was Susan. Susan Barnes entered James's life like a flame in a room full of gasoline. She was older, intense, unpredictable. With her came new beliefs, new obsessions, and new rituals. Jen remembered the first time she heard her mother say the name Susan. She said it cautiously, like the word was sharp and could cut her tongue. It didn't take long for Susan to take over everything. Under her influence, the man Jen once trusted began experimenting with psychedelic drugs, LSD, mushrooms, anything strange Susan placed in his hands. Day by day, the drugs peeled away the man Jen remembered, replacing him with someone hollow-eyed and paranoid, someone who whispered about hidden enemies the way others whispered prayers. Soon, Susan and James weren't just using drugs, they were drowning in them. Their imaginations twisted into something violent and feverish. Their delusions began to shape a new reality, one where witches ruled the world from the shadows, and they believed they had been chosen as the ones to destroy them. Susan, in her madness, believed she was a prophet. James believed she was the right hand of God. Together, they believed they had a mission: hunt the witches. Kill the witches. Save the world. Jen didn't understand any of it. She only saw her father slipping away, changing into someone unrecognizable. And each time she prayed he would come back to her, he moved further into Susan's world, even deeper into her control. Soon, whispers spread through California about a strange couple living on farms, drifting through communes, speaking in coded language, and predicting the end of the world. But behind the whispers, something else was happening, something far darker. People were disappearing. Young friends, drifters, and workers who crossed paths with Susan and James simply vanished, leaving behind empty tents, unpaid wages, or nothing at all. The news wouldn't know it yet. The police wouldn't know it yet. But Jen would soon learn the horrifying truth. Her father wasn't just breaking. He was becoming a killer. The witch killers. That's what the country would one day call them. But for Jen, long before the headlines, there were smaller horrors. The nights she spent shivering in Susan's strange, forest-like house. The dark rooms full of hanging branches and potted trees that made the entire place feel alive and watching. The psychedelic food Susan forced on her, bitter, strange-smelling meals with barley, herbs, and, unknown to Jen, laced drugs. There were days when Jen was alone for hours, hungry and scared, wandering the maze-like house while her father and Susan lay passed out naked on the floor, mumbling to invisible spirits. There were nights when she tried to escape, dialing 0 from a corded phone and begging the operator to find her mother. Worst of all was Susan's obsession. She believed Jen was a demon. She believed she needed to exorcise her. It began with harsh words, then frightening rituals, then physical abuse. Susan would dunk Jen underwater, screaming that she would force the demon out. She clawed Jen's back so hard her nails broke skin, leaving long gashes that looked like a wild animal attack. "You can fool your father," Susan would hiss, her eyes wide and glassy, "but I know you're the devil. I will drag the demon out of you." Little Jen trembled, praying her father would stop the woman hurting her. But each time she looked at him, he looked lost, distant, like he wasn't even in the same world anymore. Eventually, Jen's mother discovered the truth. Legal custody didn't matter anymore. She took Jen and ran, disappearing from Susan and James's world the way one flees a house set ablaze. For 3 years, mother and daughter hid. Meanwhile, the killings continued. Karen Barnes, the bright 23-year-old actress who had once dreamed of a life on screen, was the first confirmed victim. She had joined Susan and James's strange world out of curiosity, seeking adventure among the colorful spirits of California's bohemian culture. But she had not known the darkness waiting behind their smiles. One night, Susan decided Karen was a witch. She told James that the young woman needed to die. In his trance-like devotion, James obeyed. He attacked Karen while she slept, stabbing and bludgeoning her until nothing remained of the hopeful Hollywood dreamer she once was. And then they ran. The couple traveled north, eventually settling on an illegal marijuana farm near Alder Point, California, a wild, isolated place where no one would question two odd workers living under fake names. Susan cultivated the plants. James worked security. They lived quietly, until another man crossed their path. His name was Clark Stevens. Brave, bold, outspoken. He wasn't afraid to disagree with Susan, something no one in their delusional world was allowed to do. A small argument about how to trim the plants erupted into an accusation of witchcraft. Susan labeled him a witch. That was all James needed. James shot Clark in the head. They burned his body with gasoline. They buried the remains under manure. But the forest refused to keep the secret. A group of campers later found their dog playing with something in the woods, a human head. The discovery sent shockwaves through the area, but the killers slipped through the cracks. Under false names, they remained invisible. Until June 12, 1982. A rescue team searching for missing hikers stumbled upon two strange figures running through the forest like wild animals. Hair knotted, clothes shredded, eyes empty, Susan and James looked less like people and more like feral creatures lost in their own fractured minds. The rescuers watched as the pair suddenly fled, dropping a backpack in their panic. When the team opened it, the truth spilled out. A gun, fake IDs, and a manifesto titled A Cry for War. Inside that manifesto were instructions for nuclear war, bombings, assassinations, and a list of witches they planned to kill. One name chilled the rescuers to the bone. Ronald Wilson Reagan, President of the United States. Suddenly, everything changed. The Secret Service got involved. The hunt for the witch killers officially began. Back in her hidden home, Jen overheard the men in black suits when they came looking for information. She didn't fully understand, but she knew something was terribly wrong. "Daddy is in trouble," she whispered to herself. Days later, her mother confirmed it. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Your father hurt people," she said gently. Jen asked the only question a child could. "Are they dead?" "Yes." The world stopped. Jen remembered her father teaching her how to tie her shoes, carrying her on his shoulders, making her laugh. And now, this? How could he be the same person? Her young heart fractured. Her memory split in two. Before Susan. After Susan. Somewhere far from her, the couple continued their descent into madness. Their final killing was the most public, and the one that sealed their fate. A man named John Hellier picked them up while driving. A simple act of kindness. But in Susan's twisted beliefs, it became an offense punishable by death. She accused him of touching her leg, declared him a witch, and ordered James to kill. On a highway, in full view of witnesses, a vicious fight erupted. A struggle for a gun. Screaming. Blood. A knife appearing in Susan's hand. 10 minutes of chaos ending in 2 gunshots to the head. John died on the side of the road. Susan and James fled. A high-speed chase followed. Gunfire. A crashed truck. 2 killers running through the woods. And finally, handcuffs. But for Jen, the nightmare had only begun. Because now the whole world knew. The whole world saw them on TV. Smiling. Laughing. Kissing in court like celebrities. And Jen sat there, a broken little girl, realizing. The hands that once held her had killed. The arms that once carried her had destroyed lives. And she whispered to herself a thought that would haunt her for years. If Daddy could kill, anyone could kill. She started sleeping with scissors under her pillow. And the darkness followed her into adulthood. The years that followed felt like walking barefoot across shattered glass. Jen tried to grow up like any other child, school, friends, sleepovers, but the shadow of her father's crimes followed her everywhere, like a stain she couldn't wash off. Even when no one mentioned the famous witch killers, she could feel the silence, the stares, the cold curiosity behind every whispered conversation. She was still young enough to want normal things, peace, belonging, a sense of safety. But normalcy is delicate, and hers was already broken. Children who see monsters in their own parents do not grow up like everyone else. Their innocence is not lost, it is stolen. At school, Jen learned to hide herself. She kept her sleeves long, her voice quiet, her eyes downcast. When teachers asked about her father, she lied politely. When classmates whispered rumors, she pretended not to hear. Every time someone said his name, James Carson, she felt her throat tighten, as if her body were trying to silence itself before the memories escaped. Her mother tried to build a peaceful life for them both, but fear had carved itself into Jen's bones. Every night, she checked the locks twice. Every morning, she studied strangers' faces to see if they were following her. She kept scissors under her pillow because it felt like the only control she had left. Even though Susan and James were behind bars, she feared their followers, their delusions, their belief that demons walked in human form. And she feared, most of all, that the darkness inside them was inside her too. As Jen grew into adolescence, the world continued to push and pull at her identity. She saw her father on television sometimes, smiling from inside a courtroom, holding Susan's hand like a groom posing for a wedding portrait. News anchors discussed him with a detached fascination, like a bizarre artifact from a distant era. They always used the same chilling phrase, self-proclaimed witch killers. Analysts debated whether he was insane, brainwashed, or evil. Jen never knew what to feel when she saw him. She remembered the father who carried her on his shoulders at the beach, who sang silly songs in the car. But she also remembered the man who allowed terror into their home, who stood silent while Susan tried to drown her, who killed strangers because a hallucination told him to. Was the man she loved ever real? Or had she loved a mask? These questions haunted her long after the trials ended. Years passed, and Jen tried to hide from anything connected to her father. She avoided his name. She avoided documentaries. She avoided the truth. But pain ignored is pain that grows fangs, and eventually, she could no longer outrun it. The first time she walked into a therapist's office, she was in her 20s. She sat stiffly on the suede couch, fingers locked together so tightly her knuckles turned white. The therapist, a calm woman with gentle eyes, introduced herself and asked Jen why she had come. Jen didn't know how to answer. How do you explain that you're afraid of your own childhood? How do you articulate a fear so deep it has become part of your identity? She finally whispered the truth. My father killed people. The therapist didn't flinch. That small, steady reaction cracked something open inside Jen. For the first time, she spoke out loud the memories she had buried, Susan's nails digging into her back, her father's blank eyes, the phone calls to the operator, the endless terror. The sessions became a slow unraveling of knots tied tight since childhood. But healing was never linear. Some days she felt strong, like she was finally reclaiming her narrative. Other days, she felt like she was drowning in mud. Trauma is a shadow that doesn't disappear, it changes shape. Jen found stability in her 20s, but stability is fragile. She married young, seeking safety in the idea of family. Her husband was kind, warm, and patient, everything she needed. But wounds you refuse to examine will bleed through even the strongest bandages. It didn't matter that he had never hurt her. It didn't matter that he loved her. Whenever he raised his voice, even slightly, her childhood reawakened. Her heart raced. Her skin prickled. She felt 8 years old again, trapped under Susan's hand, choking on fear. Her husband never understood why she reacted the way she did. How could he? Jen didn't know how to explain the chaos inside her. She didn't have the language for it yet. Their marriage faded. It wasn't about love. It was about the ghost Jen dragged behind her like chains. By her early 30s, Jen realized she needed to confront the past head-on, not just survive around it. She reached out to support groups for children of violent criminals, a small, hidden community that understood what society never could. Talking to others who carried similar burdens made her feel less like an anomaly, more like a survivor. Slowly, she learned that her father's actions were not her legacy. Meanwhile, James Carson lived his own warped version of life behind prison bars. He and Susan appealed their convictions repeatedly, sometimes with rambling, handwritten documents full of bizarre claims, visions, missions from God, spiritual warfare. Susan eventually died in prison. James did not. When Jen learned of Susan's death, she felt nothing. Not relief. Not joy. Not vengeance. Just silence. A silence so empty it echoed. But knowing Susan was gone brought an unexpected shift. It meant there was now only one person left who shared the darkest chapters of her life. Her father. Jen spent years debating one question. Should she visit him? A part of her longed to see his face, to understand how much of the man she once knew remained. Another part feared that looking into his eyes would confirm her worst fear, that he was gone forever, replaced entirely by the madness Susan nurtured. The battle inside her dragged on for years. Eventually, she made a decision. She would face him. But first, she needed to understand him, not the myth, not the murderer, but the human being swallowed by delusion. She reached out to psychologists, forensic experts, criminologists. She studied cult behavior, trauma, LSD-induced psychosis, manipulation, and shared delusional disorder. Piece by piece, she built a map of the broken mind her father had become trapped inside. And in studying him, she discovered herself. She understood why she couldn't trust her instincts, why she feared her own emotions, why relationships were so hard. She understood how deeply a child internalizes the chaos of the adults who raise them. But knowing the truth didn't erase the pain. The day she finally stood outside the prison, her heart beat so violently she feared she would collapse. The fences, the guards, the cold walls, none of it scared her as much as the thought of facing the man who had once been her hero. When he entered the room, she barely recognized him. Age had carved deep lines into his face. His hair was gray, his frame thinner, his eyes subdued, like someone who had been living underwater for too long. But when he saw her, something flickered. Not madness. Not delusion. Something human. Jen didn't move. She felt like she was looking at a ghost wearing her father's skin. He sat down slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his voice cracked. "Jenny?" The sound of that childhood nickname shattered her composure. Tears rose unbidden, a storm she had held back for decades. He reached out a trembling hand but then hesitated, unsure if he was allowed to touch her. She didn't move toward him. She needed answers, not embraces. "You let her try to kill me." He closed his eyes. "I know. You believed her more than you believed me." Silence. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I see it now. I see all of it. Too late, but I see it." The sincerity, the brokenness, it confused her. It didn't erase anything. It didn't excuse anything. But it wasn't the face of the monster she had imagined. It was the face of a deeply damaged man who had allowed a dangerous woman to puppeteer his mind. Jen left the prison with shaking hands, unsure of how to process what she had seen. Healing wasn't a straight line, and answers didn't always bring closure. But something had changed. Something subtle, but powerful. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel afraid of her own father. That night, she sat alone in her room, staring at an old photograph, a picture of her as a child, sitting on her father's shoulders, laughing at something only the two of them could remember. And she realized something she had never admitted before. She missed the man he used to be. Even if that man had existed only for a short time. The world would always see James Carson as a killer. But Jen had seen all versions of him. The father. The victim. The believer. The monster. The prisoner. And now, she had one final mission. To tell the truth. The whole truth. Not for him. For herself. For the first time, she understood. Her story wasn't about the witch killers. It was about a child who survived them. The truth has a strange way of following a person. It hides in memories, in dreams, in faces we pass on the street, in the quiet moments when the world is still. For Jen, the truth followed her like a second shadow, always a step behind, always watching. And even after confronting her father in prison, she knew her journey was far from over. She had survived her childhood. She had faced the man who broke it. Now she had to confront the world that still whispered his name. The media had never fully let go of the witch killers. Every few years, a documentary resurfaced. A YouTube video. A podcast. A sensational headline. Strangers who knew nothing about her father's mental collapse acted like experts behind glowing screens. They debated whether her father was insane or evil. Whether Susan had been a cult leader or just a delusional addict. They discussed the murders like entertainment, like stories in a horror anthology. And always, someone commented. Did they have a kid? Jen had lived most of her life in fear of that question. So she hid. She changed her name. She moved towns. She erased her online presence. She lived quietly, privately, deliberately. But secrets grow heavier with time. You can carry them for years, but eventually, they eat through the skin. By her late 30s, Jen could no longer pretend she was untouched by the past. She didn't want to live in fear forever. She wanted to reclaim what the world had stolen from her. The first step was to understand trauma, not as a victim, but as a researcher. She joined seminars, attended conferences, read academic papers on child abuse, brainwashing, shared psychosis, and post-traumatic stress. She spoke with survivors of cults, children of killers, victims of religious extremism, and adults who had grown up in violent homes. Slowly, she built a community, not of people who pitied her, but of people who understood her. One day, during a lecture on trauma bonding, a professor spoke a sentence that hit Jen like a thunderclap. Children don't stop loving their parents when they are abused. They stopped loving themselves. Jen felt tears rise to her eyes before she could stop them. That single sentence explained decades of pain. She always wondered why she blamed herself, for the drowning attempts, for the nights of terror, for the abandonment. She understood now. Children internalize the chaos they grow up in. They blame themselves so their world makes sense. That night, she went home, sat at her kitchen table, and opened a blank notebook. For the first time, she wrote without fear. She wrote about Susan's brutality. About the drugs. About the forest house. About the screaming. About the nights she dialed 0 just to hear a stranger's voice. About the scissors she hid under her pillow. About the parents she lost long before the world knew them as killers. She wrote until her hand cramped. She wrote until dawn. Those pages would become the foundation of something larger, something she didn't yet have the courage to admit she was building. Her story. But telling a story that the world only knew half of was dangerous. The internet could be cruel. The public could be ravenous. People romanticized killers. They made fan art of them, wore t-shirts with their faces, treated murderers like celebrities. Jen hated that. Sometimes she saw pictures of her father online, young, shirtless, wild-eyed, treated like a bohemian anti-hero. Strangers commented things like, crazy couple, but iconic vibe. They were kind of cool. They were spiritual revolutionaries gone too far. Jen felt sick each time. Cool? Iconic? Revolutionaries? Her father and Susan weren't symbols. They weren't legends. They weren't characters in a horror film. They were real. They were dangerous. They killed people. And the victims had names. Dreams. Families. Lives. Jen knew if she ever told her story, she had to do it for the victims too. And yet, a small voice inside her whispered that she couldn't hide forever. She couldn't let strangers define her father's story, or her own. She couldn't let Susan remain the puppeteer of her past. One night, after a support group meeting, Jen walked alone through a quiet street. A cool wind rustled through the trees. The street lights flickered softly. She stopped by a storefront window and saw her reflection. Older now, stronger, her eyes carrying decades of storms. For the first time in her life, she didn't see fear in her face. She saw resolve. It was time. She didn't go to the media. She didn't contact a reporter. She didn't post on social media. She went somewhere better. A crime podcast that focused on victims, not killers. A show known for giving survivors control over their narratives. She emailed the host anonymously at first. Weeks passed. Then months. Finally, one cold November evening, she received a reply. We would be honored to hear your story. Jen hesitated for days. Fear gnawed at her. What if people attacked her? What if they blamed her? What if telling the truth opened wounds she wasn't ready to face? But another thought emerged. What if it freed her? She went to the studio on a rainy morning. The host greeted her with respect, not curiosity. The team dimmed the lights, closed the blinds, and gave her space. When she sat in front of the microphone, she thought her voice might fail her entirely. Then the host asked, "Why did you decide to speak now?" Jen closed her eyes. Because silence is also a prison. From there, everything poured out. Her childhood. The fear. The abuse. The murders. The trial. The prison visit. The unanswered questions. But she did not speak with anger. She spoke with clarity. With compassion. With truth. And she said something that shocked even her. I don't want my father remembered as a monster. I want him remembered as a warning. When the episode released, Jen panicked. She turned off her phone. Closed her laptop. She expected hate, judgment, harassment. Instead, something remarkable happened. People listened. People understood. People thanked her. Survivors of cults messaged her. Children of criminals told her they felt seen. Strangers apologized for glamorizing her father's crimes. Even criminologists praised her bravery. Jen cried reading the messages. For the first time in her life, she felt not alone, but connected. But with attention came something else. Something unexpected. A letter. From her father. The prison envelope was plain, stamped, impersonal. But inside was a handwritten note, shaky and uneven. Jenny? I heard the podcast. I am proud of you. Thank you for telling the truth. I hope one day you can forgive me. Love. Dad. Jen read the letter again and again, her emotions twisting violently. Forgive him? Could she? Should she? Forgiveness wasn't a door she could open or close easily. It was a hallway she might walk down someday, but not yet. Still, she kept the letter. Not out of love, but because it reminded her of something important. She had survived. She had grown stronger. She had reclaimed her voice. And she wasn't done yet. That night, she sat at her desk, opened her notebook again, and wrote the first sentence of what would become her memoir. This is not a story about killers. This is a story about a child who lived. And for the first time, she felt peace blooming quietly inside her chest. The story she once tried to run from was now the story she was destined to tell. The past has sharp edges, but the future is carved slowly, sometimes painfully, into something new. For Jen, the final chapter of her healing didn't begin with a dramatic moment. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, on an ordinary morning when she realized she had gone an entire week without waking up from a nightmare. For most of her life, sleep had been a battlefield. She dreamed of forests with no exits, of Susan's voice whispering from shadows, of her father's empty eyes staring through her. She dreamed of drowning, choking, running. And always, she woke up gasping. But now, something had shifted. She woke to sunlight, not fear. To stillness, not panic. To possibility, not dread. It was subtle. Fragile. But real. Jen had spent decades running from what she'd lived through. But confronting the truth, on the podcast, in therapy, in her writing, had cracked open a doorway she'd never dared to touch before. A doorway that led somewhere she had once believed impossible. Freedom. Not freedom from the past, that would never exist. But freedom from the belief that the past defined her. She continued writing her memoir through winter. Some chapters came easily. Others left her trembling, her hands cold, her breath shallow. Memories she thought she had buried resurfaced with startling clarity. The cold bathtub during the forced exorcisms, the hallucinogenic smell of the strange food Susan cooked, the humid silence of the forest farms, her father's distant stare when he was too far gone to recognize her. But for the first time, she faced those memories with strength instead of fear. She wasn't the helpless child anymore. She was the narrator now. And with each page she wrote, the darkness loosened its grip. One night, while revisiting old police files, Jen found something she had never seen before, photographs from her father's arrest. She stared at the images, unable to tear her eyes away. There he was, wild, thin, sweating, feral. His hair matted. His clothes torn. His face contorted in a mix of rage and delusion. This was the man the world had come to know. But it wasn't the man she remembered. She closed the folder and pushed it away. Her father was two people. The man who raised her. The man who killed. Both were true. Both were real. But neither controlled her anymore. Weeks later, Jen received a letter she didn't expect. It wasn't from her father this time. It was from a victim's sister. Jen froze when she saw the name. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a simple handwritten note. I heard your interview. I can't bring my brother back. But I want you to know, I don't blame you. I hope you find peace. Jen pressed the letter to her chest and cried, deep, heavy sobs that came from a place she had kept locked for decades. In that moment, grief and relief intertwined. She cried for the victims. For the families. For the little girl she once was. For the father she lost. For the years consumed by silence and fear. But she also cried because, for the first time, someone connected to the violence had offered her forgiveness. She didn't expect it. She didn't believe she deserved it. But she needed it. Jen wrote back, a long, heartfelt letter filled with compassion and sorrow. It was not closure. Closure didn't exist in stories like hers. But it was connection. And connection, she realized, was more healing than silence. As winter thawed into spring, Jen's life began expanding in ways she never anticipated. She started speaking at trauma workshops, sharing not the details of her father's crimes, but the emotional scars they left behind. She taught others what she had finally learned, that surviving a violent legacy was an act of courage, not shame. At her talks, people often approached her with tears in their eyes, children of abusive parents, survivors of extremist households, adults who grew up too fast. They clung to her words like lifelines. You helped me feel seen, one woman whispered. I thought I was alone, said another. Jen listened, hugged them gently, and reminded each one. You are not your parents' crimes. You are not their mistakes. You are not the darkness they carried. Meanwhile, her memoir grew into something powerful, raw, honest, and deeply human. When she submitted it to publishers under her legal name, she expected silence or rejection. Instead, multiple publishers wanted it. One editor wrote back, "This is not a book about murder. This is a book about survival." And survival was exactly what Jen wanted the world to understand. After months of revisions, fact-checking, and emotional endurance, the book was finished. Holding the final manuscript in her hands, Jen felt something she never expected. Pride. Not pride in the tragedy. Not pride in the pain. But pride in the bravery it took to turn chaos into meaning. When the book finally released, she didn't hide her identity. She didn't blur her face. She didn't disguise her voice. She stepped into the world fully, openly, unbroken. The media attention was immediate, but different this time. The focus wasn't on the sensational crimes, nor on her father's infamy. It was on Jen herself. On the child who survived horrors few could imagine. On the woman who turned trauma into testimony. On the courage it took to reclaim a stolen narrative. She sat for interviews. She spoke on panels. She appeared on stages. Each time, her voice grew steadier. She didn't glamorize the killers. She didn't dramatize the violence. She honored the victims. She honored the truth. And slowly, the world began to understand the real message of her story. That children of killers deserve compassion. Not judgment. Understanding. Not suspicion. Healing. Not silence. One evening, months after the book tour began, Jen stood at the edge of a quiet lake. The water shimmered under a soft orange sunset. The air was cool and sweet. She held the last letter her father had ever written to her, the apology she still didn't know how to accept. After a long breath, she crouched at the water's edge and placed the letter on the surface. The paper softened, curled, drifted. The ink blurred into soft blue stains. She didn't burn it. She didn't tear it. She didn't reject it. She let it go. Not as an act of forgiveness, but as an act of release. In that moment, she understood something profound. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about excusing. It wasn't even about forgiving. Healing was about reclaiming the power that trauma once stole. And she had finally done it. Jen rose to her feet, wiped her cheeks gently, and looked out over the vast, shimmering water. Her story had begun in darkness, but it did not end there. It ended in clarity. In courage. In light. And somewhere, deep within her, the little girl who once hid beneath blankets, who trembled in a forest house, who prayed to survive, finally felt safe. After all these years, she had given that child what no one else could. A future. A life. A voice. And for the first time, the story of the witch killers was no longer just a tragedy. It was a testimony. A warning. A rebirth. A victory.